Hello, BookTube. Well, it's March, and that means everyone on BookTube is doing March of the Mammoths, where you take a book that's over 800 pages off your bookshelf, something that's been intimidating you for a while, and you at least start it in March. And so for me, that book was Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, which is a bit of a strange pick. I'm aware of that. It wouldn't be my first pick either in terms of doing a booktube event like March of the Mammoths, but it did fit the bill. It is a book that's been sitting on my bookshelf that's over 800 pages. That's been intimidating me, and I've really wanted to read it for a little bit now. So I took advantage of that and decided to read it this month. Even though, something like, War and Peace is more in line with, I think, maybe the spirit of the event. But regardless, this is the one that I wanted to do for this month, and I'm really glad I did because I had a really great time reading it, and I just kind of wanted to talk about it today. The first thing I wanted to mention is that I made a video about this previous, but I had read prior to Trotsky this book, John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, and I loved it. And it turned out that reading these two as a pair was a really good idea. So in addition to recommending Trotsky, I also thoroughly recommend 10 Days That Shook the World by John Reed. Now, of course, you don't have to read both of them. They're both independently great as well. But reading them as a pair was a really special reading experience that I wasn't intending on being, so positive. But it really was. And the reason for that is just because, this is a condensed history of, well, really only the third volume that is Trotsky's History of the Revolution. But it just makes for a really great prelude. It makes for a really great, sort of introduction, I guess, to what Trotsky will be developing in his own history of the revolution. And Trotsky is very much a fan of John Reed. And so he mentions John Reed many times throughout his history of the Russian Revolution, and even goes so far as to pull a scene directly out of the 10 Days That Shook the World and use it to just really great effect in his own work. So those two together made for a really great reading experience, and if you want something unique and cool, I definitely would recommend it. If you haven't, if you're interested in the subject and haven't read either, they pair really, really well together. I also wanted to mention that I'm not making this video or talking about Trotsky because I'm a Trotskyite or I hate Trotsky, both of which are things that people feel. Trotsky inspires a lot of opinions, even today, which I think is really interesting. And of course I have my own, but I'm only making this video because I like reading about the Russian history, just generally, but the Russian Revolution specifically. So that's why I read it, and I'm talking about it on camera today because I talk about what I read on this channel, and this is what I read for this month. So but no, I'm not talking about this because I'm about to develop this video into some sort of ideological screed or something like that. I happen to really enjoy the book, though, and I will say, well, let's talk about how the book is structured. So, as I mentioned, it is broken up into 3 volumes. The first volume is called Overthrow of Tsarism. The second volume is called The Attempted Counter-Revolution, and the third volume is called The Triumph of the Soviets. In other words, the first volume is about what's known as the February Revolution. Now, the February Revolution, as Trotsky points out in that title, overthrows the Tsar. And then the second volume is covering the intervening period between that first revolution in February and what is the second revolution in October. Those intervening months include pivotal moments like what has been referred to as the July days. Trotsky calls this, time period the attempted counter-revolution. This is where the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, the Black 100, the various political parties are vying for power in Russia now that there's a power vacuum, now that the Tsar is no longer, holding the top spot in the country. And then that third volume is about the triumph of the Soviets. It's about the October Revolution. It's about the assuming of power of the Soviets through Lenin and Trotsky, especially. So it makes for a lot of dramatic reading. Now, for me, I actually had the most fun with the book in that first volume. I loved reading about the February Revolution, and I loved reading how ironic and biting Trotsky is throughout the entire throughout his entire retelling of it. He opens up with just a brutal depiction of poor Tsar Nicholas II. He calls him basically a sociopath, and has spares no feelings for the Tsarina, Tsar Nicholas's wife. And he also talks a lot about Rasputin. And I wanted to read, actually, something that I didn't really realize with Rasputin at all. I found this fascinating. Trotsky writes, "The murder of Rasputin played a colossal role, but a very different one from that upon which its perpetrators and inspirers had counted. It did not weaken the crisis, but sharpened it. People talked of the murder everywhere, in the palaces, the staffs, at the factories, and the peasants' huts. The inference drew itself. Even the Grand Dukes have no other recourse against the leprous camarilla except poison and the revolver. The poet Bloch wrote of the murder of Rasputin, quote, 'The bullet which killed him reached the very heart of the ruling dynasty.'" I didn't know that. I have wanted to read a biography of Rasputin for a long time, and now I'm definitely going to make that a priority. Obviously, I was aware of who Rasputin was. He's a very popular figure. He has a, cultural influence that is undeniable, but I had no idea that he was that politically significant in Russia. And the fact that that's something that Trotsky is openly acknowledging and talking about, I think, is really interesting. So it's anecdotes like that and stories like that make that section really my favorite. I also think that it's just incredibly dramatic the way he talks about the turning, basically the mutiny of the infantry. It really is just a fascinating and exhilarating read. Not that the rest of the book is boring or takes a dip in quality or anything like that. In fact, the chapter that begins the third volume, and that's a chapter called "The Peasantry Before October," I think is my single favorite chapter in the entire book. I thought that chapter was amazing, and it was so good, in fact, that I really feel like it could be anthologized. You could just rip it out and read it on its own. I think it's just fantastic the way that Trotsky sets the stage for the October Revolution. It really just stands on its own as a great piece of writing. But it also, in context, is really great, too, because just before that, this is another thing I wanted to read, just before that, at the end of Volume 2, Trotsky quotes Lenin, and so this is Lenin speaking. He says, "We are not charlatans," said Lenin immediately after his arrival. "We must base ourselves only upon the consciousness of the masses. Even if it is necessary to remain in a minority, be it so. We must not be afraid to be a minority. We will carry on the work of criticism in order to free the masses from deceit. Our line will prove right. All the oppressed will come to us. They have no other way out." And then Trotsky says, here we have the Bolshevik policy, comprehensible from beginning to end as the direct opposite of demagogism and adventurism, which I think is fascinating, and I think part of the reason that I love that chapter so much at the beginning of the third volume, which is that Trotsky throughout this book, but also during the events of the revolution, and as well as Lenin himself, are just completely certain of their own agenda. They are not willing to compromise at any point with that agenda, even if that means that they are willing to take a minority position, even if that means they are willing to be smeared politically, even if that means that they are willing to hurt themselves in their overall popularity in the short term, because they are absolutely certain that if they stick with their principles and if they stick with what they know to be the lessons of history, that eventually the masses and the proletariat will be on their side, and they will be bolstered by that support into the highest offices of the country. And I thought that was just fascinating. Now, obviously, Trotsky is writing from a very particular ideology. He's writing from a very particular place. And in the 21st century, we do not share that anymore. Even if you like Trotsky or whatnot, it's really hard to be in the exact same, 19th century mindset or, 20th century mindset. But regardless, it is fascinating just how certain Trotsky and Lenin were, in particular, those two in particular, to the point that Trotsky is very much critical of even some of his fellow Bolsheviks for not being as certain of their own rightness as he and Lenin are, to the cause and to what they believe to be, scientific processes of history that are guaranteed certain outcomes or guarantee them certain outcomes. That's the way that this entire volume is written, which, you would expect, considering the fact that, Trotsky has the benefit of hindsight. But what's interesting is that Trotsky also does a really good job of making you feel, at least I felt, that these were opinions and ideas that he shared throughout the entire time. And that's why he was able to make very certain steps, and as well as Lenin were able to make take these steps, which to many of their contemporaries felt and seemed completely radical and completely strange, and very much isolating, and yet ended up paying off for them in the end. So seeing that was really, really interesting as well. And I wanted to read, this is how Trotsky prefaces his book, and you can see some of that in these quotes as well. He says, "This work will not rely in any degree upon personal recollections. The circumstance that the author was a participant in the events does not free him from the obligation to base his exposition upon historically verified documents. The author speaks of himself insofar that it is demanded by the course of events in the third person, and that is not a mere literary form. The subjective tone, inevitable in autobiographies or memoirs, is not permissible in a work of history." He then goes on a page later to say, "The serious and critical reader will not want a treacherous impartiality, which offers him a cup of conciliation with a well-settled poison of reactionary hate at the bottom, but a scientific conscientiousness, which, for its sympathies and antipathies, open and undisguised, seeks support in an honest study of the facts and determination of their real connections, an exposure of the casual laws of their movement. That is the only possible historic objectivism, and moreover it is amply sufficient, for it is verified and attested not by the intentions of the historian, for which only he himself can vouch, but the natural laws revealed to him by the historical process itself." Now, I know that probably sounded pretty convoluted, because it is, and it does give you a good insight into how the whole of this book is written. Although I will say that once you spend 900 or so pages reading that, you do kind of settle into what he's talking about a little bit better. But basically, he's talking about this historical or this scientific conscientiousness, this idea that the job of the historian is to talk about these historical processes that he believes are scientific and set in stone. And that allows him to be, let's see here, he uses the word partial. So it allows him to be partial or biased, but also loyal to the facts, because those facts are immutable. They are predetermined in a way as well. So regardless, I know that that's not how history is written now, and that's a good thing. I'm glad that we don't all write like Trotsky, but it is very interesting to read somebody who is writing from this very unique perspective. And again, one of those things is that Trotsky is so close to the revolution. And what's funny is that it really does feel, and it's hard to not feel this way, that this book would have been better if it was a memoir, if it was more personal, if he had a less, I mean, that portion that I just read to you, I'm sure, was confusing. I know it was confusing to me, because it does overdose on a kind of, academicness and, ideological, prescriptions and whatnot that, make it a lot less entertaining to read than I think it could be. And that's part of the reason why John Reed is so great. In fact, they have on the back here that amazing moment where he goes, it flashed upon me suddenly they were going to shoot me. And certainly there isn't a single moment in Trotsky where he talks in such a personalized manner. But regardless, he is eloquent. I don't want to make it sound like he isn't. I mean, there are times when he is eloquent, and he's also extremely passionate as well. And so, in other words, he does overcome that. And I don't think that the history of the Russian Revolution is dry. It's dense. But dense and dry are not necessarily the same thing. If you read this and give up on it, I totally understand. I think that there were moments in the second volume in particular when I was really getting bogged down because Trotsky is not holding your hand throughout this history. He is not trying to ingratiate you to who he's talking about. He's just moving through the events in this, scientific manner. And so you really have to just kind of let things that you don't really know what he's talking about kind of roll off you and just, keep moving. At least that's what I did. If I stopped at every moment that I was like, wait, what is he talking about? I never would have finished it. Overall, I think I have a pretty good handle on what I read, but at the same time, I know for a fact that I need to keep reading, and then eventually I will return to it one day and hopefully get a lot more out of it. But as a first sort of going over, I really had a fun time with it. I think overall, it was a really good reading experience, and I'm obviously glad that I did it. Just if you're going to read it yourself, know what you're getting into. It's dense, it's difficult, and you might be better off reading something more modern, more contemporary about the Russian Revolution. There are plenty of resources on that, or at least indulge in the Wikipedia page. And of course, I ambiguously recommend this. This is just an electrifying book, in my opinion. So I think that's all I really wanted to talk about today. Trotsky gets a recommend from me. John Reed gets a recommend from me. And I'll see you in my next video. Thank you, BookTube.